The decommission order had 17 signatures on it. I was the 18th. My hand did not shake. I want to be clear about that. My hand did not shake, and the coffee I drank while signing it was still hot, and the lights in the relay station hummed the same way they always hummed, and nothing about that morning announced itself as the end of anything. My name is Mara Solis. I was, until 0914 on a Tuesday in March, Earth's senior interstellar liaison for the Western Helix Array. After 0914, I was a woman with a very specific skill set and nowhere particular to use it. The Interstellar Withdrawal Act had passed with 71% of the vote. 71. That is not a squeaker. That is not a divided nation holding its breath. That is a species that made up its mind with the quiet, exhausted certainty of someone finally canceling a subscription they should have canceled years ago. 3 centuries of being the galaxy's most reliable middleman, translator, grief counselor, trade arbitrator, and general emotional load-bearing wall, and humanity had looked at the invoice and said, "No more." I voted against it. Then I filed the paperwork to implement it because that is what you do when you work for a government and the government decides something. You file the paperwork. You do your job. You drink your coffee while it is still hot. The Helix Array was 312 years old. My grandmother's grandmother had been alive when they switched it on. The original builders called it a bridge. Everyone after them called it the network. I always called it the noise, because that is what it was, really. 3 centuries of constant noise coming in from 40-something species across 11 star systems. And Earth sitting at the center of it, all like the one kid in class who speaks every language and therefore gets volunteered for every group project whether they want to be or not. We did not conquer the galaxy. I want to make that very clear because the stories always get that part wrong. We did not arrive with weapons or flags or any particular plan. We arrived with a gift for languages and a deep cultural discomfort with watching things fall apart when we could theoretically do something about it. That is not heroism. That is anxiety with good PR. The Vreth found us first. They are large, gray, and communicate in a tonal system that sounds, to human ears, like someone slowly tearing expensive fabric. We learned it in 11 months. They were so startled by this that they introduced us to the Sali, who communicated in light pulse patterns, and the Sali introduced us to the Orville, who sang everything. And within 40 years, we were the galaxy's unofficial switchboard because we were the only ones who had bothered to learn everyone else's language instead of insisting everyone learn ours. We did not mean to become indispensable, we just kept showing up. The shutdown sequence took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Every relay, every signal tower, every quantum link beacon we had planted across 11 systems, going dark in sequence, like someone walking through a house at night and turning off the lights room by room. I watched the board. Green, 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 gone, green, green, gone, gone. The technician running the sequence, a young man named Owen Cole who had been working the night shift for 6 months, and had the particular hollow look of someone who survives on vending machine sandwiches and mild existential dread, did not say anything. He watched his board. He did his job. The room smelled like recycled air and old carpet and the specific silence of a decision already made. 37 seconds before the final relay cut, a signal came in on the emergency band. Not a diplomatic transmission, not a trade request, not a conflict flag, not any of the 1,000 varieties of bureaucratic noise I had learned to process without blinking. It was audio. Raw, uncompressed audio on a frequency the Orville used for what their linguists translated loosely as community singing. The kind they did at gatherings, at beginnings of things, at endings. A child's voice. I did not know the song. I had spent 19 years in interstellar liaison, and I did not know that song, which meant it was new, which meant someone had written it recently, which meant something had happened recently that warranted a new song. And I would never know what because Owen Cole's hand was already moving, and the board was already going, and green became gone became dark. I filed the shutdown confirmation at 0921. I poured a second cup of coffee. I stood at the window of the relay station and looked at the dish array on the hillside outside. 300 meters of beautiful, expensive, now useless engineering pointing at a sky that was no longer listening. The morning was clear. A hawk circled somewhere to the left. Owen Cole started quietly eating a granola bar behind me. The quiet was enormous. Not peaceful, enormous. The difference matters. Peaceful quiet is what you feel after a long day when the house finally settles. This was the quiet of a room after a loud argument when everyone has left and the furniture still remembers the shape of the shouting. 3 centuries of signal, gone in 4 minutes 30 seconds. I thought about something my predecessor in this role, a woman named Gloria Adami, had told me on my first day. She had been liaison for 22 years and had the kind of calm that comes from having seen too much to be surprised by any of it. She poured me coffee, same as I was pouring now, and she said, "Mara, the thing you have to understand about this job is that we are not diplomats. Diplomats negotiate. We translate. And translation is not just language. It is the decision every single time about which parts to keep and which parts to soften. We are not a bridge. We are a filter, and the galaxy has no idea." I had been 29. I had thought she was being dramatic. I drank my coffee. The hawk was gone. The emergency band was still open, technically, for another 11 minutes while secondary systems completed their shutdown cycle. 11 minutes of one-way listening, no transmission capability, just a window cracked open while the house closed down. No more signals came in. Or rather, none that registered as signals. There was static. There is always static. But static has texture if you know how to read it, and I had spent 19 years learning to read it. And what I heard in that 11 minutes was the specific texture of a lot of very different voices all beginning to say something at once and finding, for the first time in 300 years, that there was no one on the other end. At 09:32 the board went fully dark. Owen Cole crumpled his granola bar wrapper, set it on the console, looked at it, said, "So that's that." "That's that," I said. He nodded. He had the decency not to say anything else. I respected him enormously for it. I picked up my folder. I had 14 more forms to file before noon, 3 debrief sessions scheduled for the afternoon, and a dinner reservation at a restaurant near the station that did a very good lamb dish that I had been looking forward to all week. Life goes on. That is the human specialty, really. Not exploration, not conquest, not even diplomacy. Life goes on. I was almost at the door when I stopped. I turned back to the board. Dark every light, every signal indicator, every relay confirmation. The whole board dark as a sky with no stars, which is a thing I had never seen and never wanted to see and was now looking at directly. The child had been singing. I stood there for a long time, long enough that Owen Cole stopped pretending to reorganize his console and just sat very still, the way people sit when they are giving someone else room to feel something without making it awkward. I turned away from the board. I walked out. Behind me, the relay station hummed the same way it always hummed. The lights did their job. The coffee went cold on the counter. Somewhere in 11 star systems, 40-something species were waking up to a silence they had never heard before and did not yet have words for. I had words for it. I just did not know yet whether those words were the beginning of something or the end. I would find out. That is the other human specialty, the one nobody ever puts in the history books because it is not dramatic enough. We always find out. We always look. We stand at the dark board and we turn away, and then 3 steps down the hall we stop, and we think about a child singing on a frequency nobody is listening to anymore, and we turn around. Not yet. But we turn around. 8 months of silence is long enough for the galaxy to start bleeding and short enough that most people have not noticed the blood yet. I noticed. It was, by that point, my specific and unofficial and entirely unauthorized job to notice. The intelligence reports were not mine to receive. I want to say that plainly. I had been formally separated from the liaison office at the end of March, handed a certificate of service, a handshake from a deputy undersecretary whose name I have already forgotten, and a very sincere offer to transition into an advisory role that involved writing policy papers and attending conferences and never again doing anything that actually mattered. I had thanked him. I had taken the certificate. I had not taken the advisory role. What I had taken was a small apartment in Madrid, a standing coffee order at the place on the corner that did not ask questions, and a back-channel connection to a man named Felix Acaffer. Felix had worked signals intelligence for the liaison office for 11 years. He had the kind of face that made people underestimate him, open and easy and quick to smile, and he used it the way a card player uses a bad hand, making everyone comfortable right up until they were not. He was still embedded in what remained of the interstellar monitoring infrastructure, the skeleton crew that watched the dark board and logged the nothing that came across it. Officially, he monitored for anomalies. Unofficially, he forwarded them to me. My kitchen table became a map of the end of the world. Not dramatically. That is the thing about collapse, and I mean real collapse, not the movie kind with explosions and speeches, but the actual kind. The actual kind looks like a spreadsheet. It looks like a list of things that used to work and no longer do, and the list is long and the items are small, and you have to read the whole list before you understand that the small items are not small at all. They are load-bearing, and the structure they were holding up is enormous. I kept a list. I call it that now, the list, because I showed it to people later, and that is the word they used. I had 47 items on it by November. I am going to tell you 12 of them, because 12 is the number it takes before the pattern becomes undeniable. 1. The Vrethsali Trade Corridor, which had operated continuously for 211 years without a single armed incident, flagged its first territorial dispute within 6 weeks of the array going dark. By week 9, it was a blockade. By week 14, both sides had moved military assets to the border. 2. The Lorith Consortium, a 7-species economic body that handled resource distribution across 4 systems, missed its quarterly arbitration session because no one could agree on a neutral chair. For 200 years, the neutral chair had always been human. No one had ever thought to designate a backup. 3. The Pelhari, a species whose communication style requires a third-party mediator present even for internal government decisions, a peculiarity of their social structure that humans had been accommodating for 90 years, held a parliamentary session without a mediator for the first time, and it ended without resolution. The session after that ended without resolution. The one after that did not end at all. 4. 7 separate species sent transmissions to Earth on old frequencies, back channels, emergency bands, anything they could find. Not to beg, not to negotiate, to ask with what Felix described as an unmistakable undercurrent of alarm whether the silence was deliberate, whether we were watching, whether this was something we had planned. I read that one 3 times. They thought we had engineered this. They thought the galaxy's most reliable middleman had, after 300 years, decided to pull the rug and see what happened. They did not believe we had simply left because we were tired. It did not map onto their understanding of us. Honestly, I understood why. We had not in 300 years ever simply left. Someone had always come back. Someone had always picked up the signal. The idea that we had walked away because 71% of us voted to was, from the outside, indistinguishable from a strategy. 5. The Orville Moon, designated Station Vicinity 7 in the old liaison maps, went dark on its primary transmitter. Not destroyed. Dark. Offline. Felix flagged it as low priority. I flagged it as the thing that kept me awake at 3 a.m. looking at my kitchen ceiling. The Orville were not a military species. They were not political players. They were small, arboreal, sang everything, and lived on one moon positioned between 2 now-warring civilizations. They had no weapons. They had no fleet. They had one trade agreement, brokered 14 years ago by a liaison attaché named Daniel Reyes, who had since retired and was, as far as I knew, living in the town of Guadalajara teaching secondary school geography. When the corridor around their moon became contested territory, They had no way to ask anyone for help. They had a transmitter, they used it, nobody answered. 6. A species called the Ven, whose entire legal system was built on a concept that has no English equivalent but translates roughly as witnessed agreement, meaning no contract is valid without a third-party witness. Both sides trust equally, found that their entire commercial and legal infrastructure had quietly seized up. They had always used humans as witnesses, not because we held legal authority, because both sides trusted us not to favor either of them. We were, in the language of their legal tradition, clean. We were the only ones they agreed on. Without us, every contract they tried to sign was disputed before the ink dried. 7. 3 species whose populations overlapped in a shared system had maintained coexistence through what the liaison files called the buffer protocol, which was a very official name for the deeply unofficial practice of having a human diplomat physically present at every joint event, council meeting, and resource negotiation, not as a participant, but as a presence, a witness, a reminder that someone from outside was watching and would remember and might someday tell someone else. Without that presence, the joint meeting stopped happening, not because anyone declared hostilities, because no one called the meetings, because calling a meeting implied someone would show up who both sides respected equally, and that person no longer existed in their corner of the galaxy. 8 through 12 I will compress, because the shape of them is the same shape and you have already understood it. A communication protocol that relied on human-built translation matrices, now orphaned and untranslatable. A medical exchange program between 2 species with incompatible biology, brokered and maintained for 60 years by human xenobiologists, now suspended. 2 colonies that had been founded on planets in a disputed system, their continued existence guaranteed by nothing more than a human diplomatic presence that had been formally withdrawn, now unguaranteed. An early warning system for a stellar event that required multi-species coordination to monitor properly, now unmonitored because the coordination had dissolved. And a species, small and quiet and in the middle of everyone else's business, that had been singing on a frequency no one listened to anymore. I stared at my list for a long time. The problem with being a translator, the thing Gloria Adami had understood and had tried to tell me, and that I had only now, sitting at a kitchen table in Madrid with 47 items on a list, finally understood in my body rather than just my head, is that you become invisible in proportion to how well you do your job. When the translation is perfect, no one sees it. The Vreth and the Sali talked to each other and felt they understood each other and never once stopped to consider that a human was standing between them, choosing, every single time, which words to use, which parts to soften, which edges to sand down. We were not a bridge, Gloria was right, we were a filter, and a filter, by definition, disappears into the thing it is filtering. They did not know what they had until the water came out wrong. Felix sent me a new file at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in November. He flagged it urgent, which Felix almost never did, because Felix had the intelligence officer's trained instinct for not creating alarm before alarm was warranted. I opened it before I was fully awake. It was an audio file. Recovered signal, old frequency, partial transmission, heavily degraded. The Orville again. Not the child this time. An adult voice, older, with the formal register the Orville used for what Daniel Reyes's old field notes had called matters of community record. The things they sang so they would not be forgotten. The translation was rough. Felix had run it through the old matrices, the ones we had not decommissioned because they were archived rather than active, and the margins of error were wide. But the core of it came through. They were singing the names of their dead. Not casualties of violence, not yet, the ones who had not survived the fear, the elderly, the very young, the ones who had needed medicines that came through the trade corridor that was now a military blockade, the ones who had waited for a signal back and died waiting. I sat at my kitchen table in Madrid at 2 in the morning, and I read a list of names I could not pronounce in a language I only partially understood, And I thought about 71% of my species casting a vote in a warm polling booth and going home to dinner. They were not wrong to vote the way they voted. I need to say that. 300 years of being everyone else's emotional labor is a real thing. The exhaustion was real. The cost was real. There were humans who had spent their entire careers in deep space doing invisible work for species that barely understood humans existed as individuals rather than as a category, and they came home diminished, and nobody in the galaxy sent them a thank you note. The withdrawal was not evil, it was tired. But tired people make decisions that travel further than they can see. I added a 48th item to my list. Then I closed the file. I made coffee. I stood at the window and watched the Madrid street below, a few people walking, headlights, a dog pulling at its leash, the ordinary resistant aliveness of a city at 2 in the morning. My laptop was still open on the table. I sat back down. I started writing. I did not know yet what I was writing toward. I did not know if I was building a case for return or a case for having been right to leave. I did not know if it mattered. I only knew that 48 items was too many to look at without doing something, and the particular flavor of my sleeplessness was the kind that comes not from fear, but from an idea that has no shape yet but is already taking up space. I wrote until morning. The coffee went cold. The street outside got louder. Somewhere across 11 star systems, people were waking up to the 48th day or the 52nd day or the 203rd day of a silence they had not chosen, and they were doing what everyone does in the face of a silence they did not choose. They were filling it with fear, with old grievances, with the particular kind of violence that grows in the absence of anyone who might remember it and tell someone else. I wrote until my fingers hurt. Then I picked up the phone and called the one number I had been avoiding for 8 months. The number rang 4 times. A man answered. He sounded like he had been awake for a while. "Felix," I said, "I need a meeting with the committee." A pause. "Myra," another pause. "You know they're going to push back." "Yes." "You know they think the decision was correct." "Yes." "You know this could go very badly for you politically." "Felix," I looked at my list. 48 items. The names of the Orville dead in a file on my laptop. A child singing on a frequency no one was listening to. "Get me the meeting." He got me the meeting. The committee met in a building that was designed to feel temporary but had been there for 40 years. That is the way of bureaucratic architecture. It intends impermanence and achieves a different kind of permanence entirely, the permanence of things that were supposed to be transitional and simply never got around to ending. I had been to this building 11 times in my career, always as a briefer, always with someone more senior sitting beside me, always with the implicit understanding that my job was to provide data and theirs was to decide what to do with it. This was the first time I was going in alone, with a folder under my arm and 48 items, and the particular energy of a person who has not slept properly in 2 months, and has therefore stopped being afraid of things they should probably still be afraid of. The session was closed. 7 committee members, 2 staffers taking notes, a chair whose name was Lawrence Brent, who had been head of the Interstellar Oversight Committee for 6 years, and had the manner of a man who had heard every possible argument and was very comfortable hearing them again. He shook my hand. "Liaison Solis, we appreciate you coming." I was no longer liaison anything, but I did not correct him. I sat down. I opened my folder. I put my list on the table. "There are 48 items on this list," I said. "I will walk you through the ones that matter most. I would like to get through the material before anyone asks me what I think the solution is, because I do not actually know what the solution is yet, and I think it is important that you hear the problem clearly before we start arguing about fixes." Lawrence Brent nodded slowly. He had the look of a man recalibrating his expectations for the morning. "Good." I started with the Vrethsali corridor. Clean, quantifiable, the kind of data point that lands on people who think in geopolitical terms. A 200-year-old piece that lasted exactly 6 weeks past the helix array going dark. I put the timeline on the table. I walked them through it. I did not editorialize. Then I walked them through the Lorith Consortium, the Pelhari parliamentary sessions, the Venn legal crisis. I gave them the numbers. I gave them the timelines. I watched their faces. Committee members have a professional face, the same face that judges and surgeons and very experienced poker players have, a face that is designed to receive information without reflecting it. But professional faces are not impermeable. They are just slower. And if you watch carefully enough, you see the moment the information gets through. I watched carefully. I got through item 19 before I saw the first crack. It was in the face of a woman named Patricia Home, who handled resource and infrastructure policy and had a reputation for caring about things she was not required to care about, which is the most dangerous kind of bureaucrat. She was looking at the Venn legal crisis summary, and she was very still in the particular way that people go still when they are doing math they do not want to do. I kept going. I saved the Orville for the end, not for dramatic effect, because I needed them to understand the shape of the systemic failure before I showed them what the systemic failure looked like at its smallest and most specific. You cannot feel the scale of something by starting with the individual. You have to build the scale first. You have to show them the whole collapsing structure before you show them who was standing inside it. I talked about the Orville moon, the trade corridor it sat in, the blockade, the transmitter going dark. I did not play the audio file, I described it. I told them what the translation said. I told them what it meant. I told them about Daniel Reyes. A retired attaché, I said, 63 years old, teaching secondary school geography. He spent 8 years on that moon. He learned their songs. He negotiated the one trade agreement that kept their supply lines stable. When he left, his case was filed as closed because the agreement was in place, and agreements are supposed to be self-sustaining. I paused. They are not self-sustaining. Nothing is self-sustaining. That is the thing we built our entire interstellar presence on for 300 years, and then forgot to write down anywhere. The room was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet. When they have received something, they cannot immediately metabolize. Then a man named Gerald Fox, who managed political liaison for the committee and had, I knew from experience, the instinct of someone who is always looking for the argument that gets him out of the uncomfortable room, cleared his throat. Liaison soles, he said, with respect. The correlation between human withdrawal and these incidents is noted, but correlation is not causation. These species had centuries to build independent frameworks. If they failed to do so, that is a structural problem with their own institutions. I looked at him. Yes, I said, it is. He blinked. He had expected pushback. Their institutions failed to develop independence because ours kept showing up, I said. We did not let them fail because we could not tolerate the failure. We kept patching. We kept translating. We kept being the neutral party because we were good at it and because something in us, 3 centuries of something in us, cannot watch a thing break down when we have the tools to fix it. We created the dependency. We maintained it. And then we left without building a replacement for ourselves because we were too tired to think about what happened after we left. I closed my folder. I am not here to tell you the withdrawal was wrong, I said. The people who voted for it were not wrong about being exhausted. They were not wrong that the cost was too high and had been too high for too long. They were wrong about one thing. I looked at Lawrence Brent. They thought the galaxy would manage. The room was very quiet. Patricia Holmes said, without looking up from her papers, "The Orville, the names of their dead, that was in your file." Yes. How many? It was not a question the way she said it. It was the sentence of someone who already knows the number is going to be hard to hear and is asking anyway because that is what honest people do. I told her. She nodded once. She put her pen down. She picked it back up. Gerald Fox said nothing else for the rest of the session. I walked them through the rest of the list, all 48 items. I did not rush. I did not soften. I had spent 8 months building this case in a kitchen in Madrid at 2 in the morning, and the people in this room had the authority to do something with it, and I was going to make sure they understood every single piece of it before I let them out of their chairs. When I finished, Lawrence Brent said, "What are you proposing?" I told you, I do not have a solution yet. You have something. He was right. I had the beginning of something. 3 pages of notes I had written at 4 am on a Tuesday, titled, in the draft header I had not yet changed, "The Embarrassingly Informal Framework for Not Letting Everything Fall Apart." I had not brought those 3 pages to the meeting. They were not ready. I was not ready. I have a direction, I said, not a solution. Then give us the direction. I thought about how to say it. I had been thinking about how to say it for 2 months, and I still did not have language clean enough for it, which was deeply ironic given that language had been my entire career. We went back to stop being needed, I said, which was the right instinct, but you cannot stop being needed by disappearing. You stop being needed by staying and teaching someone else to do what you do and then stepping back. We skipped the middle part. We just left. I picked up my folder, I stood. The galaxy did not build an infrastructure to replace us because we never gave it the chance to. We were always there, and then we were not. Those are not 2 parts of the same plan. Those are 2 unconnected decisions made by different people in different decades with no one responsible for the space between them. I looked at Lawrence Brent one more time. That space is where people are dying. I walked to the door. I will have a formal proposal ready in 3 weeks, I said. I would appreciate the committee staying available. I walked out. The hallway was long and bright and smelled like the particular institutional cleanliness of buildings where important decisions get made and nobody opens a window. I walked the length of it. I pushed through the door into the outside air. It was a cool day, gray sky. A pigeon was doing something ambitious with a piece of bread near the steps. My phone buzzed, Felix. The message said, "How did it go?" I stood on the steps of a building in a city on a planet that had voted, 71%, to stop being responsible for the galaxy. And I looked at the gray sky, and I thought about 48 items on a list, and a child singing, and a man named Daniel Reyes teaching geography in Guadalajara who had no idea yet what was happening on the moon where he had once learned to sing in a language made entirely of music. I typed back, "They heard it." Felix replied, "That's not the same as listening." I put my phone in my pocket. I walked to where I had parked my car. I had a 3-week deadline and 3 pages of notes with a terrible working title, and the bone-deep certainty that the committee would debate my proposal for longer than the galaxy had left for comfortable debate. I was right about that. But that is the thing about humans, the thing I had been trying to articulate for 8 months and had not yet found the right sentence for. We hear things. We sit in bright hallways and we go home and we make coffee and we stare at lists. And then, whether or not the committee has finished debating, whether or not the paperwork is approved, whether or not anyone official has given anyone official permission, we do the next thing. We were already doing it. I just did not know that yet. Nobody announced it. That is the part that the news coverage always gets wrong when they try to reconstruct the timeline afterward. There was no meeting, no coordinated decision, no memo from any government body, no official channel, no sanctioned program. Nobody stood up in a room and said, "Here is what we are going to do." 40,000 people simply left. Not together, not with a shared itinerary or a unified purpose. They left the way water moves through cracks, finding the available paths, filling the available spaces, not because someone told the water to go there, but because that is what water does when there is a crack and a difference in pressure. I found out the way everyone found out, through a fragment. Felix sent me a short message at 7 in the morning on a Monday, 6 weeks after my committee presentation, which said only, "Are you watching the transit logs?" I was not watching the transit logs. I had been asleep, which was something I was doing again in reasonable amounts since I had submitted my formal proposal and entered the long purgatory of waiting for institutional response. I got up. I made coffee. I pulled the transit logs Felix had attached. Private vessel departures, 41 days of them. Starting small, a few dozen per week, the kind of numbers that disappear in the noise of ordinary traffic. But Felix had isolated the destination tags, cross-referenced them with the old liaison station registries, plotted them on the sector map. They were going back. Not to Earth stations, not to any official human installation. They were going to the places on the map that the liaison office had vacated, the places where the green lights had gone dark, the places on my list. I stared at the screen for a long time. I pulled the individual records, not military, not government, not corporate expeditions or resource surveys or any of the categories that might explain organized movement. The vessels were small, privately owned or chartered. The passenger manifests were exactly the kind of people you would expect if you understood the problem and understood human beings. Retired liaison attachés, xenolinguists, trade arbiters who had spent decades in deep space and come home when the withdrawal passed and apparently lasted less than a year in their quiet retired lives before deciding that quiet retired life was not, in the end, the thing they were built for. Grief counselors who had worked the Pelhari Parliamentary Support Program, a medical team that had run the species-to-species health exchange for 20 years. 3 xenobiologists who had been tracking the stellar monitoring system that was now going unmonitored. And on one manifest, on a small chartered transport heading toward the sector that included the system, where a little moon sat between 2 warring civilizations and a trade corridor that was now a blockade. One name. Daniel Reyes, occupation listed as educator, destination listed as the way station closest to Orville-adjacent space. Baggage, 3 bags which the manifest noted exceeded standard allowance by 1 bag and for which he had paid the overage fee without comment. I read his name 3 times. Then I called Felix. How many total? I asked. As of this morning, 42,600 and change, and that is only the ones I can track through legitimate channels. Estimate at least another 20% moving through routes I cannot see. 50,000 people. Give or take. I sat with that for a moment. 50,000 people who had not been asked, who had not been authorized, who had not waited for the committee to finish debating or the proposal to be approved or the correct institutional framework to be constructed around the correct institutional process, who had looked at the list and decided, each one separately, that the list was long enough. The government knows, I asked. The government, Felix said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite frustration, and was in fact both things worn smooth by years of watching humans do what humans do, is having several meetings about it. I could imagine the meetings. I had spent my entire career in the meetings where people who were responsible for large systems tried to catch up with the people who were simply inside the systems, already acting. The meetings were always several steps behind. That is the nature of meetings. Is anyone trying to stop them? Stop them? Felix paused. Mara, they are retired translators and grief counselors taking personal vehicles into areas of active diplomatic tension. Nobody has the legal architecture to stop them. Nobody has the moral architecture to stop them. Frankly, nobody has the nerve to try, because the ones who do understand what is happening know that standing up and saying officially, "Do not go, these people are not authorized," would require explaining publicly what they are going back to fix, and that explanation would be its own kind of disaster for the people who approved the withdrawal. He was right. It was simpler to look away from 50,000 people quietly putting 3 bags in a chartered transport. What about the warring civilizations? I asked. The Vreth and the Sali, if civilians are moving into that corridor. That, Felix said, is the interesting part. He sent me a second file. I opened it. It was a signal intercept. Both the Vreth and the Sali, separately, through completely independent channels, had flagged the presence of human civilians in the contested corridor. Both of them, again separately, in their own languages and their own formal registers, had issued the same order to their respective military assets. Hold position, do not engage, human civilians present. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, because it required 3 readings to fully understand what I was looking at. 2 civilizations that had spent the better part of a year working themselves toward open conflict, that had moved military assets and established blockades and flagged each other's vessels as hostile, had both independently decided that the presence of a few dozen private human vessels was sufficient reason to stop. Not because humans had authority over them, not because we had threatened them or negotiated with them, or deployed any of the tools of official diplomacy. We had not. We were not there officially. We were there as a retired xenolinguist on a personal ship and a grief counselor who had called in a favor, and a 74-year-old retired military translator named Ruth Gallagher, who had told her daughter she would be back when things settled down and had not specified a date. They stopped because of what we were, because of what 300 years of showing up had made us in their understanding of the universe. Not powerful, not dangerous, the opposite of dangerous. We were the people who came back. And in a galaxy that had spent 8 months watching humans leave, the sight of us coming back meant something neither side wanted to be responsible for destroying. I put the intercept down. I picked up my formal proposal, the one sitting in an institutional queue waiting for committee votes. I looked at it. 27 pages of careful language and layered recommendations, and phased return strategies and resource allocation models. I put it back down. Then I picked up a piece of paper, the actual kind, because sometimes the actual kind is what a moment requires, and I wrote 1 sentence on it. 1 line. The line I had been trying to find for 8 months in Madrid at 2 in the morning over cold coffee and 48 items on a list. It said, "We did not build the galaxy's trust with authority. We built it by showing up until showing up was enough." I looked at it. It was true, but it was not a policy recommendation. It was not a framework. It was not anything you could put in front of a committee and ask them to vote on. I put it in my pocket anyway. Felix called back 10 minutes later. "There is something else," he said, "something you need to see." The something I needed to see was a partial intercept from the Orville moon. The transmitter that had gone dark had come back online. Faint signal, low power, clearly operating on reserve systems, but online. And the signal it was broadcasting was not a distress call. It was not a formal transmission on any diplomatic band. It was music. Specifically, it was 2 voices, one Orville and one very determinedly human and badly pitched, singing the same song at the same time in a language that was made entirely of intervals and breath. Daniel Reyes had 3 bags in 6 weeks, and apparently had been learning the songs before he even bought his ticket. I sat at my kitchen table in Madrid, and I listened to a retired secondary school geography teacher sing badly in a language made of music with a child he had not seen in 4 years, on a moon between 2 armies that had agreed to wait, and I felt something that I am not going to name, because naming it makes it smaller than it is. I will tell you this, I finished my formal proposal that day, all 27 pages revised, tightened, clarified. I sent it to Felix to forward to the committee. I changed the title. I had been calling it the embarrassingly informal framework for not letting everything fall apart, which was accurate but not, as a title, what you wanted going into an official institutional process. I renamed it the Return Protocol, a framework for graduated re-engagement based on community-driven presence. Dry, institutional, perfectly suited for the 11 meetings it would endure before being approved. I sent it. I made coffee. I stood at the window of my apartment and thought about Ruth Gallagher, 74 years old, telling her daughter she would be back when things settled down. Ruth was currently, according to Felix's latest update, running an informal conflict arbitration session between Junior Vreth and Sali officers on a way station in the contested corridor. She had done this entirely on her own initiative. She had brought sandwiches, apparently. The specifics of the sandwiches had made it into the signal report, which told you something about the state of the galaxy and the kinds of details that matter when things are falling apart. The committee would debate my proposal for 9 weeks. In those 9 weeks, 11 more people would join Ruth at the way station. 3 xenolinguists would establish a temporary translation relay in the Lorith Consortium. A retired Pelhari liaison specialist named Owen Cole, who it turned out had not gone back to shuffling papers after the array shutdown after all, had flown to the Pelhari home system and was sitting in the lobby of their parliamentary building asking if they needed a witness. They did. He sat there for 6 days before they let him in. When they let him in, their parliament finished a session for the first time in 9 months. Nobody sent a press release. Nobody filed a report. Owen Cole ate a vending machine sandwich in a parliamentary lobby on a planet that was not his and waited until he was useful, and that was that, and the galaxy got one small thing back that it had not known how to ask for. 50,000 people, no plan, no coordinator, no mission statement. Just the particular human inability to look at a problem and do nothing when there was a plane to catch, and 3 bags of supplies, and a skill set that happened to be exactly what was needed in the exact place it was most needed. I put on my coat. I picked up my own bag, which I had started packing 3 days ago without consciously deciding to, and which had been sitting by the door where I had not been looking at it directly. I picked up the piece of paper with the one sentence on it. I folded it into my coat pocket. I locked the apartment. I had a flight to catch. The assembly hall on Station Velara had been built by 4 species in collaborative design sessions that lasted 7 years, and resulted in a space that managed to be simultaneously too large and too intimate. The ceiling at a height that made every species feel slightly exposed. The seating configured in a curve that meant everyone could see everyone else's face. I had always thought it was either very good design or a very detailed accident. Standing at the speaker's podium 3 years after the day I had filed the shutdown order, I was leaning toward accident. There were 41 delegates in the room, not 400, not the sprawling interstellar parliament that the old liaison architecture had once convened. 41. The number was deliberate. My proposal, after 9 weeks of committee debate and 14 rounds of revision and one memorable afternoon, where a deputy undersecretary had described it as aggressively modest in scope, which I mean as a compliment, had been approved with one core principle intact. We were not coming back to be what we had been. We were coming back to help build what should have existed in the first place. 41 delegates from 19 species. Every one of them had requested this assembly through their own channels, not through a human invitation, through their own initiative, their own desire to be in this room, which was a difference that mattered more than I can explain in the language of policy papers. I had not slept well. I had not slept well for 3 years, honestly, with brief exceptions, but the particular quality of my sleeplessness the night before this assembly was different from the kitchen in Madrid variety. That had been the sleeplessness of a person who knows what the problem is and does not yet know what to do. This was the sleeplessness of a person who knows what they are about to say and is not entirely certain the words will hold the weight they need to hold. Lawrence Brent was in the room. He had not needed to be there. He had come anyway, sitting in the observer section with the quiet, attentive expression of a man who has watched something go from a one-sentence note on a piece of paper to a room full of 41 species delegates and is doing his own private accounting. Felix was in the room. He was the one who had forwarded 48 items to a woman in Madrid who was supposed to be retired. He sat in the back with his open, easy, quick-to-smile face, and I knew what was behind it, and I was glad he was there. Patricia Home was in the room. She had left the committee 6 months into the proposal process and joined the field team. She was currently the informal liaison between the Venn legal system and a team of 3 retired human contract specialists who had been helping the VEN build a new witnessed agreement framework that did not require a human in the room. The framework was almost ready. In another year, Patricia thought, they would not need her anymore. She had told me this with the specific satisfaction of someone who has finally understood what success is supposed to look like. Daniel Reyes was not in the room. He was on the Orville moon. He had not left. He had kept saying he would come back once things stabilized, and things kept becoming more stable partly because he was there, which created a situation he seemed comfortable with, and his daughter back in Guadalajara seemed philosophical about. He had sent a voice message for the assembly. I had it on my tablet. Ruth Gallagher was not in the room either. She was at the way station in the contested corridor, where she was running her 14th conflict arbitration session between VRETH and SALI officers, and had, by all accounts, become something of a legend on both sides. Her daughter had stopped asking for return dates. She sent care packages. Owen Cole was in the room. He was sitting 3 rows back on the left side with the expression of a man who had spent a lot of time in parliamentary lobbies eating vending machine sandwiches, and had learned to be patient in a way that looked like serenity from the outside. He nodded at me when I looked his way. I looked at my notes, then I put them down. I had written and rewritten the opening of this speech 11 times. Every version was accurate. None of them felt like the right thing to say first. The right thing to say first was not in my notes. We were very bad at leaving, I said. The room was quiet in the interested way, rather than the awkward way. We had good reasons. 3 centuries is a long time to be everyone else's emergency contact, and the cost of that was real, and the people who bore it deserved to come home. I am not standing here to tell you the withdrawal was a mistake. I am standing here to tell you it was incomplete. We left without finishing what leaving actually requires, which is making sure the thing you were holding is held by someone else before you let go. I looked at the delegates. 41 faces, some of them legible to me after 3 years of work, some still opaque in the way that non-human faces can be opaque. I looked at them anyway. This assembly is not a return to the old structure. The old structure made us indispensable in a way that served neither us nor you. It made you dependent and made us unable to leave without causing damage, and that is not a partnership. That is a system that benefited from never having to grow up. I paused. We grew up. We are asking you to grow with us. I told them about the framework, not the 27-page version with the phased protocols and resource allocation models, though those existed and were available and several of the delegates had read them already. The version I told them was smaller and more honest. Human specialists in a supporting role, not a leading one. Translation assistance, while each species built its own multilingual infrastructure. Conflict mediation paired with local mediation training, so that the local systems could eventually do it without us. A sunset clause on every human-led program, a date by which the humans involved were required to hand off to local practitioners, or the program ended. Not a bridge this time. Not a filter, a scaffold, temporary and load-bearing, and designed from the start to be removed once the structure could hold itself. Gerald Fox, who had made it into the observer section despite my private wish that he would be busy, raised his hand during the open session. And if a species does not want the scaffold, if they prefer the old arrangement, then they do not get it, I said. The old arrangement is not available. We are not offering to become indispensable again. We are offering to help you become independent. Those are different things, and you do not get to choose between them. He did not look satisfied. I was comfortable with that. After the formal session, there was an informal reception in the adjacent hall, the kind of event that exists to let people talk to each other without the weight of official record. I was standing near the window, watching the star field outside, holding a drink I had not taken a sip of, when the Orville delegate found me. I had known she was in the assembly. Felix had flagged her arrival the night before. I had seen her in the room during my speech, sitting in the 3rd row, her species' formal posture translated into this seating configuration as a kind of careful stillness, hands folded, eyes very alert. I had not been able to read her expression and had spent the entire speech doing my best not to try. She was, according to the registration, 14 years old by Orville standard reckoning. In the biological sense, she was what humans would recognize as a young adult. She was small, and her eyes were very large in the way of arboreal species, built for low light and distance. She wore the formal outer garment that Orville used for what Daniel's field notes had called community representation, which was the closest concept their culture had to diplomacy. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in English that was formal and slightly old-fashioned in its grammar, the English of someone who learned from a textbook written by a person who had learned it 2 or 3 steps removed from a native speaker. You are the one who filed the order. It was not an accusation. It was not, I thought, even a question. It was the sentence of someone who had done their research and was beginning a conversation at the correct starting point. Yes, I said. She considered this. Daniel told me about you. He said you voted against it and filed it anyway, and that this was the most human thing about the whole situation. I looked at my drink. He is not wrong. He is not often wrong, she said, with the specific serenity of someone who has spent 3 years in close proximity to a person and has arrived at a clear assessment of their accuracy. He is wrong about his singing, which is not good, but he does not know this, and we have not told him because it would be unkind, and also because his trying is part of the value. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not known was tight. He is still there, I said. He is still there, she paused. He says he will leave when he is no longer useful. We have not made him feel useless yet. We intend to for a while longer. I wanted to ask about the dead, about the names in the audio file Felix had sent me at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in November in a kitchen in Madrid. I did not ask. Some questions are answered by the fact that the person is standing in front of you at all, and asking them anyway is a kind of greed. She looked at the star field out the window. I looked at it with her. My people have a name for humans, she said. An old name. It means approximately the ones who stayed in the middle. It is descriptive rather than honorific, a neutral term for a functional role. I nodded. I had read this in the old liaison cultural notes. We have a newer name, she said. We started using it after the corridor was blocked, after the transmitter went dark, after the months when there was no signal back. I waited. It does not translate directly. The closest approximation in English is the ones who come back. She said it simply, without ceremony, the way you say a fact that has been true long enough to stop needing decoration. I stood at the window of a hall on a station built by 4 species and looked at the stars and thought about a cold kitchen in Madrid and a board going dark and a child singing on a frequency nobody was listening to, and 40,000 people who had not been asked, and a man in Guadalajara who had decided his 3 bags were more important than his retirement, and Ruth Gallagher telling her daughter a timeline that had no end in it. The ones who come back, I said. Yes. She looked at me with her large arboreal eyes and the formal Orville stillness that I was starting to read maybe a little. You did. I thought about 48 items on a list. I thought about the board going dark in 4 minutes 30 seconds. I thought about green and gone and green and gone, and the enormous quiet and the coffee going cold on the counter while a hawk circled somewhere to the left and Owen Cole crinkled a granola bar wrapper and said, "So that's that." I thought about the piece of paper in my coat pocket with 1 sentence on it. I had carried it for 3 years. I took it out. I unfolded it, a little creased now, a little worn at the fold lines, the ink still legible. We did not build the galaxy's trust with authority. We built it by showing up until showing up was enough. I looked at it for a moment, then I folded it back up. We are going to need help, I said to her. Not just from your species, from all of them. The framework only works if the people we are building it with actually want to build it. The scaffold only works if the structure wants to hold itself up eventually. We cannot want that for you. You have to want it. She looked at me steadily. We know. Some of the species in that room today are going to find it easier to let us do the work again. than to do it themselves. We know that too. We are going to disappoint them. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Daniel has a phrase he uses when his students want him to give them answers instead of helping them find answers themselves. He says, "I will be here while you learn, but I will not learn for you." That is the Ray's method. He is very proud of it. Is it working with your people? She considered. It is uncomfortable, she said. Uncomfortable is not the same as not working. I put the piece of paper back in my pocket. Across the hall, Felix was talking to a Lorith delegate with the easy-faced attentiveness he brought to every conversation, the look that made people feel heard, and that was also, always, doing the careful background work of understanding the room. Owen Cole was in conversation with two Pelhari representatives, and whatever he was saying was making them lean forward in the way that meant genuine engagement rather than polite attention. Patricia Home was on the other side of the room with a tablet, probably already drafting the follow-up report she would send before midnight. Lawrence Brent caught my eye from across the room. He raised his drink very slightly. I raised mine. Neither of us drank. It was enough. On my tablet, cued for the end of the reception, was Daniel Ray's voice message. I had listened to it once before the assembly to check the audio quality. He had recorded it in the morning, he said, early, before the Orville woke up, because mornings there were quiet and he thought best in quiet spaces. He said he was sorry he could not be in the room, but that he thought the work there was more important than the ceremony. And also he was in the middle of learning a new song, and he was at the stage of learning where stopping for too long meant forgetting, and the forgetting was worse than the learning was. He said, "Tell them we come back. Not because someone told us to, not because the paperwork cleared, because the work is not done and we know it is not done, and that is enough reason. That is always enough reason." He said, "Tell the Orville delegation, if there is one, that the moon is very quiet in the morning and I have been practicing the high intervals, and I think I am getting closer." He had laughed a little at that. A brief sound at the end of the message, warm and slightly self-aware, the laugh of a man who knows he is not getting closer but has decided that trying counts for something. I looked at the young delegate beside me. "I have a message for you," I said, "from Daniel." She turned toward me fully. The Orville formal stillness dropped, just slightly, in the way that revealed the young adult underneath the representative, the person who had learned to sing from a badly pitched geography teacher on a cold moon, and had come here to a room full of 41 species delegates and spoken English, learned 3 steps removed from a native speaker, and had stood in front of a person who had once filed an order that made her moon go quiet. He says the moon is quiet in the mornings, and he has been practicing the high intervals, and he thinks he is getting closer. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, softly, in the musical register of her language, not the formal one, the one that sounded to human ears like something between a song and a breath, a short phrase that my untrained ear could not hold but that landed anyway, the way music lands before you know what it means. I would have Felix translate it later. It meant, he is not getting closer, but we will not tell him, because his trying is part of the value. I stood at the window of the assembly hall with the star field outside, and the room behind me filling with the sound of 41 species beginning, carefully and imperfectly, to talk to each other without us in the middle, just beside them, just within reach, not a bridge and not a filter but a presence, a habit, an old and stubborn human pattern that turned out to be the best thing we ever accidentally built. We came back. We were always going to come back. Not because the paperwork cleared, not because the vote changed, not because the committee approved the proposal after 9 weeks and 14 revisions and one afternoon where a deputy undersecretary called it aggressively modest. Because somewhere in the galaxy, a transmitter had gone quiet and a child had been singing, and a man had bought a ticket and paid the overage fee on a third bag without comment. And that is the thing about us, the specific and stubborn and slightly irrational thing that 300 years of being everyone else's emergency contact had never managed to train out of us. We hear the silence. We go anyway. That is the Ray's method. He is very proud of it. It turns out so are we.